Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. We here at Slavery Archive Book Club are happy to welcome everybody to discuss Dr. Kellie CarterJackson's excellent Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists, and the Politics of Violence. A few things before I quickly and briefly introduce Dr. CarterJackson. First of all, we'll be taking questions here in Zoom. You can type them out in the chat. You're also welcome to raise your hand. To raise your hand, you need to click on the little reactions button at the bottom of your screen. It has, once you click on it, you'll see an option to raise hand, and that'll help us keep track of who wants to speak up. If you're joining us on YouTube today, you can type in a question on YouTube, and one of us will be sure that your question gets asked in the session. My name is Vanessa Holden, and I'm at the University of Kentucky. I'm of course joined by co-conveners and founders Jessica Marie Johnson and Ana Lucia Araujo, and also Alex Jill is here as well. So you'll see probably the four of us at some point during the session. We like to sneak in our own questions because it's our club, and we'll ask things if we want to. I am delighted and excited to welcome Associate Professor, newly promoted Associate Professor, Dr. Kellie CarterJackson. Wonderful friend, wonderful scholar, and author of today's book club selection. Let's see if my filter will cooperate. Force and Freedom. Huzzah! Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Dr. CarterJackson is at Wellesley. I will add her website to the chat for those of us who are with her. But if you want to look her up and you're joining us later on YouTube, you can search for her on Wellesley's website. Per usual with these events, I feel like we all want to get to the good stuff as soon as possible. So I will refrain from listing the many accolades, accomplishments, and awesomenesses of Dr. CarterJackson, and instead get us right into hearing from her about this important work. After Dr. CarterJackson gives us an intro to her work, we'll open things up for questions. Feel free to type out questions if you think of them while she's speaking. You can type them out or go ahead and raise your hand. And then we'll start fielding things because, of course, we love a good, robust discussion and conversation here at Slavery Archive Book Club. Dr. CarterJackson, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much to the Slavery Archive for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm always excited to talk about my work and Force and Freedom in particular. I will, for those of you who haven't read the book, just give you like an overview about some of the questions I was thinking about as I wrote the book. So this all started in undergrad, really. I went to the illustrious Howard University. I always, whenever I have an opportunity to speak out at Howard, I'm always doing it. And I worked with Edna Medford, and she really helped me think about Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists. And I remember taking a senior class, and one of the graduate students was like, John Brown was one of the coolest white men that ever lived. And I was like, really? Tell me more. And so it started me down this spiral of thinking about Douglass and John Brown and violence and the abolitionists. And when I got to graduate school, my advisor was Eric Foner, and he was like, listen, violence is hot. Violence is all the rage. And he was not wrong. Like, violence never goes away. It never goes out of style. And so I wanted to talk about, how do the powerless procure power? How should the oppressed respond to their oppression? What is the responsibility of the state to political dissent? And how do you advocate for yourself when you don't have the ballot, when you don't have citizenship? How do you create change? And so I looked at the work of Benjamin Quarles, who's probably one of my favorite abolitionists, and he made a very simple argument. He's like, Black abolitionists are the first abolitionists. And I was like, yeah. And I think that's because, no one needed to tell Black people slavery was wrong. They knew that already. And we're advocating for its end the moment it was, they were enslaved. And I think that when we think about slavery, I often say that slavery is conceived in violence. It's created by violence. It is sustained by violence. And so it only made sense that it would be overthrown by violence. And so I really wanted to look at a group of Black men, Black women, and their white allies and tell the story of how they shifted their thoughts from moral suasion and nonviolence and non-resistance to really thinking about direct, violent, much more aggressive forms of overthrowing the institution of slavery. I also look at Black abolitionists because I really wanted to shift the narrative. I think oftentimes when we think about Black leadership, it gets pushed to the margins, right? We think of William Lloyd Garrison, or we think of like, a lot of other white leaders. And we don't center the voices of Black leadership, or we do something that I often joke about, which is we pick one great Black man and one great Black woman per century to talk about. And that's kind of like it. So my joke is that, like, for the 18th century, it's like Phyllis Wheatley and Crispus Attucks, like one great Black man and one great Black woman. And for the 19th century, it's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And for the 20th century, it's Rosa Parks and MLK. For the 21st century, it's like Obama and Oprah. Like, I feel like these are the one, great, you get one Black person, one Black man and woman. Usually it's the man who's always speaking and the woman who's sort of mute. We don't hear a lot from, Tubman or Parks, but we hear constantly from King and Douglass. And so I just wanted to operate outside what Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of the single story. And I wanted to create a multitude of voices, particularly Black-centered voices, that were talking about uncomfortable things like violence and force, and the idea that slavery is warfare. And so that's how this book really came about. And I think I had an idea of what it would be. When you're a graduate student and you're doing your perspective, you have thoughts about what you may find when you get into the archive. And then you get there and you're like, oh, I was right. I was right. There's all of these sources of Black men and women taking up arms, defending themselves. And so this work just gets me so excited. And mostly it gets me excited because it's empowering. It's empowering to know that Black people were fighting and resisting and organizing themselves and strategizing themselves and really pushing back on this idea that they weren't entitled to their own protection. They weren't entitled to their own defense. And so the men and women in my book do just that. So I want to open up for questions, but I wanted to read a paragraph from the book. It's okay to do like a short reading. This is for those who want to follow along. I think it's the chapter on fugitives, and it's called Fight, Flight, and Fugitives. And it's the last part of the chapter. I think it's on page 77. And it's the story of John Anderson. John Anderson is an escaped slave who has run away, and he gets to Canada, and he is before a mixed audience of people. And he's like, I want to tell my story. I want to share the story of my escape. And the reason why this story or this anecdote is so important is because for decades, the abolitionists operated under this sentiment of turn the other cheek, don't return violence for violence. William Lloyd Garrison had really monopolized this idea of moral suasion and slavery is a sin. And don't worry, we can morally persuade the slaveholders that slavery is wrong. And the more and more they get deep into the 19th century, there's no new piece of legislation that favors the abolitionists. Everything benefits slaveholders. And by the time they get to the 1850s, they've been doing this for 20 years. So can you imagine, we're like, year 6, maybe 7 of the Black Lives Matter movement, but imagine being 20 years into this, still dealing with, police brutality and things of that nature. That is how, the abolitionists felt by the time they got to the 1850s. They were exasperated. And so when the fugitive slave law comes, it really is a shift where people start to say, no one's safe. Below Canada, no one's safe. So this is a story in which John Anderson is talking about how he used violence. And in it, he says, or I say, sorry. When John Anderson, an escaped slave who fled to Canada, gave his testimony before an audience, he received a great and prolonged cheering. As Anderson approached the crowd, he modestly declared that he was not used to public speaking, and he only wanted to say a few words about his experiences and escape from slavery. He reported that in order to escape bondage, he had to cut and run and fight and shed blood. Quote, "I don't like to shed blood," he added. "That is what's called fighting in war, I believe." The audience erupted with cries of, "You did right," and "Hear, hear." Anderson, heavy with regret, told the audience that he had tried everything in his ability to evade his pursuer and to avoid killing him. He had warned his pursuer that if he continued to follow him, he would slay him. Pursued for 2 or 3 hours longer, Anderson recounted that the man would not leave him, and so he killed him. Again, the audience erupted with affirmation, shouting, "Bravo," and "You did right." He concluded that while he regretted his actions, it was the only alternative to prevent being taken back into bondage. He claimed that he was a Christian man and hoped that after the murder, he could still be considered a godly man. The crowd erupted again by cheering and shouting, "It is a justifiable act." The Reverend Chairman of the meeting proclaimed that if there was any kind of defense that was right, then one should fully endorse the opinion so loudly expressed in this meeting. Then the chairman added, quote, "John Anderson did perfectly right. Does our fugitive friend look like a murderer?" The response of the audience was resounding, "Hear, hear," and "No, no." The days of non-resistance were over. Now a fugitive slave could kill his pursuer and produce excitement and applause among public audiences. He could even still be considered a Christian. And then I want to end with this last few lines where it just talks about the resistance that resulted from the fugitive slave law was an indication to the degree which Black abolitionists were willing to rely on force. At the Ohio Black State Convention, the leadership argued that white Americans could employ peaceful reform with the ballot, but Black Americans could employ reform only through violence. For too long, the Black community had turned the other cheek and engaged in the tactic of moral suasion and non-resistance and accomplished little. The fugitive slave law presented them with the impetus and the opportunity to take matters into their own hands. Individual and collective protective defense by African Americans proved their strength and their ability to manufacture change. Black leaders would be the most discussed political figures who ran not for office, but for freedom. Violence would be the new political tool for the oppressed, the new method of casting a ballot for progress. So I want to end right there, but I want to say that, like, I hope that what Force and Freedom does is it creates conversation, like real hard conversations about the utility of violence and how we understand it and its effectiveness or its capacity or incapacity to produce change. Because I think for too long we have shied away from violence in the hands of Black people because it's terrifying. And I want to push back on that idea, because when we look at violence in the hands of white people, oftentimes it's not terrifying, it's romantic, and that's problematic. And so that's what I wanted to do with this book.
Thanks so much for introducing your work for us. I want to remind everybody that you can raise your hand using the raise your hand button. If you click on the little smiley face that says reactions, raise hand is one of the things you can do. And we'll also be taking questions from the chat. So we have a question. Is it Maria? Maria, did you want to unmute and just ask your question, or should I just go ahead and read it? If you're here with us, you're welcome to unmute and ask.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you so much for sharing your work. And yeah, so my question was actually speaks to exactly what you were just mentioning, that about there's such an I think historically and even contemporary, even in reaction to, say, the movement for Black lives, there's this kind of compulsory nonviolent discourse, just like you're saying, that there's a hesitance around even talking about violence, about Black people being violent in response to oppression and white supremacy. So yeah, so I was just curious, as a scholar, I don't know if this was your dissertation.
Yeah, it was dissertation and book.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I was just curious, you obviously didn't have any hesitance, but I'm just wondering whether your mentors or your colleagues or your publishers or friends, et cetera, was there any hesitance on their part or any pushback in terms of the subject?
That's a good question. I honestly believe if I had written this book 10 years earlier, it might not have gotten published. If I had written it 10, 15 years earlier, I don't know that it would be received in the same way that it is now. I think that we're in a moment in a space right now where people are receptive to wanting to understand like what works or what doesn't work. And I think that I credit the Black Lives Matter movement in a lot of ways for enabling this discussion to like take place, because though I've been working on it for a long time with my dissertation, I wasn't quite sure what it was. The dissertation is very different from the book. And I don't know that my, advisors did either. They were kind of like, yeah, this is good. We'll see. And it took a long time, for most people who know academia is not a straight line. So, when I graduated, it wasn't like I had tons of jobs. I did postdocs, I did visiting professors and visiting professorships, and then rewrote the book over and over and over again. And then it came out 9 years later, 9 years after I graduated from Columbia. And so, but I can't say that it would have been received in the same way. I do think that we're in a moment, and that makes me really excited that we can talk about hard things in ways that we couldn't before. And maybe we can give credence to things that we were probably too terrified to touch, a generation earlier.
I have a question, and I'm just going to hop in and ask it. So you make a point, to be sure, to note that while often the story of abolitionism focuses on men, and sometimes just one or two, great men, or the women's story sometimes gets hijacked by white women's, sort of, I guess, moment of consciousness, to borrow a 70s term, and decide to advocate for white middle class women at least. But you make a real point to note that this very much was a movement of Black men and Black women. And in my own work, I found that sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to get folks to really get on board with women and children being party to violence. That this sort of really bizarre notion that somehow Black women enslaved and free just would not be involved in violence. It bears out in the documents of the time, and then some of the assumptions that scholars make, that they couldn't possibly have been involved. They're doing other things, or they're doing support work, but they're not the main event. Could you speak a little bit about how you include women in your narrative, and to what extent they're central to violence? Yes. Hello. Do we still have Kellie?
So you broke up a little bit, but I'm assuming what you asked was that what role do women, Black women, play in this, and do Black women sort of have equal partnership in the role of violence? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So one of the things that surprised me the most was how, in some ways, I think women have even more of an investment and a commitment to political violence than Black men. And that is because the violence that they have experienced is not just a physical violence, it's also a sexual violence. It's a theft of their children. It's a theft of their maternity. And so, when I see someone like Eliza, Eliza Parker is an enslaved, not enslaved woman, a fugitive woman. She was formerly enslaved. She escaped slavery with her husband, William Parker. And when a slaveholder comes to their house to like retrieve his slaves that have run away to their home to seek refuge, Eliza picks up a corn cutter. And when she picks up a corn cutter, which is kind of like a machete, if you will, she basically says, I will chop off the head of the first person who tries to give the enslaved up. And when she says this, she's talking to her brother, because her brother starts to panic and he's like, hey, the slaveholders here, the US Marshals here, like, we just need to give them up. And she's like, I'll cut off your head. She was not playing. She was not playing. There's another story I tell about a woman by the name of oh gosh, I'm forgetting her name. I used her quote for the name of an article that I wrote for the Journal of Slavery and Abolition called Dare You Meet a Woman. And now I'm drawing on her name. I want to say it's Mary Johnson. I don't know why I'm having a brain fart right now, but it'll come to me. But in it is the story of like Preston Brooks and how he canes Charles Sumner, within an inch of his life in the Senate chamber. And this woman writes an op-ed in the Daily Creole, which is a newspaper, a Black newspaper in New Orleans that had just debuted maybe the month before the caning. And isn't in the article, this is a public article. She's not writing to her girlfriend. And she says, like, you're afraid to meet a man, Preston Brooks. Dare you meet a woman? And then she's like, I'll meet you with pistols, with cowhides, with a rifle. Like what tour? You want to go? Let's go. And when I read this, I was like, who is this woman? And she's in her 50s. She's a widow. She's like, I've had 2 sons that have fought in war. Like, she's not playing around. And it's just a short op-ed that I can't believe I stumbled upon. But to me, that op-ed was everything, because here's a woman saying, I will meet you fist for fist. And she's stating it publicly. Amelia Robinson, that's her name. Amelia R. Robinson. Remember that name. She was so forceful. And I think there's a lot of women that are so forceful. The only woman we sort of think of in our public memory is Harriet Tubman, because we know that like she carries heat. She carries a pistol on her wherever she goes. But I don't think Harriet Tubman's the exception. And matter of fact, I think Tubman's the rule. Like, these women were armed at all times. And there's a lot of examples I talk about in the book, but even more so in the article, because the article allows you to take a topic just like Black women and go sort of narrow and deep with it. And all of these anecdotes I found of women, Black women put in slave catchers in chokeholds. What? That to me is just, it's incredible. It's incredible. Women are bosses. Black women are bosses. And I think, in some ways, their Black male counterparts could learn a lesson or two about courage, because they have tons of it.
Thanks so much for that. We got a question in the chat, and then we have one hand raised. So I think our chat question is first.
Sure. I'm going to...
Jessica, do you want to go ahead and read it?
Yeah, I'm going to read it because Sue has to go to another Zoom. So Sue Cozell asks, how does the argument of white violence connect to Quaker pacifists? I know that progressive Quakers began to be persuaded to violence after John Brown's effort, but not all whites in that period, I believe, supported violence against Blacks or violence as a vehicle for change. Did you address that reality in your narrative on white versus Black violence? And notes that she looks forward to reading the whole book. Dr. Jackson, thank you for this amazing presentation. So Quaker pacifism and great issues of violence among white people.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. So, it's not just the Quakers, I will say, that dominate these ideas about pacifism, because William Lloyd Garrison is not a Quaker. Oftentimes people think that he is. He had a lot of Quaker friends, but he's not. But people thought that a couple of things. One, they thought if Black people engaged in violence, it would be suicidal. Like, the idea of a successful slave revolt felt far-fetched and often felt like any attempts, even rumored attempts, and we know this throughout history, had violent backlashes against the Black community. And so they didn't think that it was strategically effective to get Black people in particular, to rise up. But I also think that there is a religious sentiment behind it that sort of pushes the idea of meekness and don't worry, God's going to avenge you, and we don't have to take up violence or use force in this way. But I say in the book that if moral suasion is the house that William Lloyd Garrison built, Black people are merely renters, right? They don't own these ideas, and they don't own them primarily because they bear the brunt of the violence. And so, like, it's all good and dandy for you to say don't be violent, but it's not your church that's being burned down, it's not your schoolhouse that's being destroyed, it's not your body that's being lynched. And so there are a lot of Black people who believe that no, it's biblical, it's religious, it is a spiritual mandate for us to defend our physical bodies. And they use the scripture as a way to push back on these ideas about, like, vengeance and protection and self-defense. Douglas talks about this a lot. He's like, it's a godly right. Henry Highland Garnett is basically like, shame on you if you don't defend yourself. David Walker, talks about this in his famous appeal. And he says, like, this is not about vengeance. This is about humanity. Like, you have a right to your own body. So I think that there are ways in which Black people are interpreting spirituality in the Bible in one way, and white people are interpreting it in another way. And sometimes they get on the same page, but John Brown is very much the exception. There were not a whole lot of John Browns in the 19th century, and I want to make that clear because it takes a lot of courage to do what John Brown did, and it also takes a lot of belief in Black humanity to do what he did. And not even the best of white abolitionists always believed in the fullness of Black humanity.
Tamika, you're next. What's your question? You can unmute and go ahead and ask.
Awesome. Thank you, Kellie. Hi, Kellie.
Hey, girl.
Thank you. Thank you for your powerful work. I really appreciate it. And so my question is, your work looks to the fugitive slave law in particular to signpost how political upheaval of the 1850s in some ways left Black abolitionists little or no choice other than violence, right? And in some ways, right, this becomes a moment in which they're defending their choice of violence. But here, my question is, how much of the story you tell is also a part of a broader continuum of warfare? And here I'm thinking about Vincent Brown's work on Taki's War, where he makes this really powerful argument that it's this slave trade that triggers, right, diasporic warfare. And I'm also thinking about Vanessa's forthcoming work on the Southampton Rebellion, and also all of the work that's being done in slavery studies that's kind of reaching back earlier to moments of activism that has been initiated by the enslaved. And then to kind of follow up with that, I'm interested in your cover and wondering how the technologies of arms themselves inform broader developments of violent resistance in this particular moment.
Hey, Tamika, really? That's a great question. I expect nothing less, but that's great. So I will say this. I will say that part of the things that I do in the book, or one of the titles of the chapter, is like fight and flight. And I think all throughout the country's history, we've had this dichotomy of choosing to fight or choosing to flee. And I think that when you look at sort of the American Revolution, the same political tensions that caused Black people to say, oh, do we just get out of Dodge? Do we side with the British? Do we side them in? Who's going to give us our freedom, right? Like, do we take up the cause to fight in order to win our freedom? Will that even win us our freedom? Or do we just get out of Dodge altogether because there are tens of thousands of enslaved people that while the master's gone fighting the war, they're like, we're out, deuces. And that happens a lot. And I think that there is something about the precariousness of warfare and political violence that creates this, should I stay and make a good stand, or do I leave? We see this happen in the Civil War as well too. And I think, there are Black people who are leaving the plantations en masse. There are Black people like Martin Delany and even Douglas who are like, should we go to Haiti? Should we go to Canada? You know, there's Marianne Shad Carey, who's like, I've been trying to tell you how to come to Canada. Like these ideas about this tension about what is the most effective strategy? I will say that. Can we make a good stand with our arms, is the theft of our labor violence enough, right? Is the theft of our bodies and our labor and strong enough undermining to damage the system of slavery? I think all of them. I think all of the above. I think all of the above for that. And I think we've seen, you know, precedents throughout history in which if you look at the Maroons in the Caribbean, like the theft of their own labor and their bodies did a lot of damage to the British Empire. If you also think about like the Maroon Wars and like, you know, the Haitian Revolution, we know that violence has an impact. So I would say all of the above, but I will say in terms of the second question, in terms of like arms, it's interesting. You know, I did an essay for 400 souls. Where is it? Over there. 400 souls, to talk about the history of the gun and race. And I'm so excited for Carol Anderson's book, because she has a book coming out this summer all about, you know, the Second Amendment and Black people. And here's the thing, you can't separate the Second Amendment and race. You cannot. Like, they are, you know, like in conjoined twins. That the way we think about guns is informed by the way that we think about race and who is entitled to protection and who is entitled to force. And that gun ownership is an extension of power in a lot of ways. The ability to have a gun and to control who lives or who dies or who does what. And so I was real emphatic with my editor about having a gun on the cover, because he was like, are you sure you want to do this? Like, you know, but to me, I felt like the gun is such a powerful metaphor tool. It's arresting, right? When you see it. And this particular revolver was also like one of the most popular revolvers of the 19th century. That's another reason why I wanted to use it. But Black people understand that if they can obtain firearms, that it is empowering, not just physically, but also politically. It is an assertion of their humanity in a lot of ways. And that denial of gun ownership is about a denial to keep Black people from defending their personhood. So, you know, I wish I did this more in the book. That's another book, I suppose, or maybe it's Carol Anderson's book, but there has to be a whole discussion about Black folks and gun ownership, and how the Second Amendment is so white supremacist. It really is.
Thank you, Kellie.
Thanks, Tamika.
Jessica, I saw your hand go up in the midst of this, so why don't you go ahead?
It did. Thank you so much, Kellie. It's so good to see you. It's so good. I was just putting in the chat, Black Women Historians of Early America, gang. Like, it's so good to be here in community with the folks, Dr. Holden included. So I have two questions. One, I think is going to be really easy. I would just love for you to talk about your framing of political violence. You make really, really clear that there is a kind of violence that you're talking about, and a kind of violence that's specific to this moment and to Black people's experiences and context in this moment. And so I just love for you to lay that out for us and talk to us about that, especially for those who are still going to get into the book. And the second question is a little more amorphous, and I'm going to try and put it into words. There is something really important about your book and the ways that it connects to last book club we were reading, Chelsea Stevers' fantastic Haiti's Paper War. So the way it connects to other kinds of conversations happening now, but I've always been part of the conversation and across the diaspora during the period of slavery about what kind of violence and what kind of world building is acceptable, is palatable, can be remembered, et cetera. And so, you know, in that context, it was about, you know, like republicanism versus, you know, empire. And in this context, it's about political violence versus moral suasion. And it strikes me that, you know, there's an interesting thread here about what is rendered unthinkable as far as what is allowed in the contemporary moment, of course, in Black people's responses to like the actual physical violence that they're under and the warfare that they're under, slavery as war, right?
Yeah.
So there's a thread here, it seems like, about what is seen as unthinkable, and then also like what historians then later see in the archive themselves, or the kind of narratives that historians write. So this is all coming around to a question about how you were able to write into some of the things that are rendered, impossible, unthinkable, untoward to talk about. I'm thinking of Mara's question earlier about like what kind of pushback, and so not that question of pushback, but how do you build a narrative into these facts of life of the moment that are also rendered impossible to consider by the profession, by the stories that we tell about ourselves here, and obviously diasporically, because we're having this conversation across many empires, across many time periods. And some of that for me is also wondering about like, what does it mean? And do you have any tips for how to write the kind of matter-of-factness of the context of people living in the wake, like in the middle, in the literal midst of violence, and make that like so clear to us, not while, because I feel like you do this, you make it so clear to us, not by parading like violence after violence after violence, but just making clear like people are really fighting for their lives in this moment.
Yes.
It's not a game, it's not romantic. So please, if you could talk some about that, go ahead.
So in the book, I talk about violence being a political language. And when I talk about political violence, what I'm trying to get people to understand is that the questions that I went back to earlier, like how should the oppressed respond to their oppression? Like how do the powerless procure power? And when I think about political violence, I think about how enslaved people are able to advocate for themselves when they don't have the ballot, when they don't have citizenship. Violence was a language that they could speak. And this is what, James McCune Smith says in the book. He says, our brethren only recognize the philosophy of force, right? We have to speak to them in their own language. They only recognize the philosophy of force. And that is because white supremacy in its purest form is violence. It's violence. There's no other, it's not about advantage and privilege, it's violence. And so when we're talking about like political violence, I'm specifically talking about how Black people can assert their humanity politically, because it is political. It's highly, when I say political, I'm not talking about like Democrat, Republican. I mean like it is contested. It is, their humanity is contested. Are you a person? Are you not a person? We don't know. You're 3/5 a person. Let's compromise. Like that's literally the way that Black humanity gets discussed. And so I think, and people have thrown this quote out a lot. I use this quote a lot too, but when MLK says like a riot is the language of the unheard, I think political violence is a language. It is a strategy. It is a tool. But to answer your second question, I think when Black people around the world use violence, it is not it is a means to an end, meaning violence is not, how do I say this to make sense? Violence is not the destination. For white supremacy, violence is the destination. For Black people, violence is the path we take to get to freedom, to get to liberty. So once we've accomplished our goal of liberation, we don't need violence anymore. But because violence is white supremacy, violence is required to sustain it. It's required to sustain the system. It's required to sustain the way of life. It is the destination. It's the journey and the destination. And so when we look at the Haitian Revolution, people are like, oh my God, it was so violent. It was so violent. Yes, it was violent. And then it stopped, right? Because they got what they need. They got emancipation. They freed the people. They actually created a revolution that abolished the institution of slavery. We can't say that for the American Revolution. We can't say that for the French Revolution. And so oftentimes when people are like, well, what does revolution look like? It looks like liberation. It looks like freedom. We've seen it. It's been in Haiti. Like, we don't have to imagine these like unrealistic utopias in order to achieve this goal. We have seen it happen before. Now, does it become short-lived in Haiti? Absolutely. But I want to talk about these concepts. It's not something that is completely foreign to us, but that is something that is possible. That's something that is doable. And I think that freaks people out because they're like, what do you mean? You want us to all take up guns? And I'm like, not necessarily, not in that way. But I'm saying that if we don't reckon with the very real violence of white supremacy, the very real violence of police brutality, of mass incarceration, and even in the pandemic, the incredible amounts of harm that are caused to Black people and brown people, if we don't reckon with that and have honest conversations about how detrimental it is and what's required to replace it, then no, I don't think we'll ever get to a place that's possible or a place that is sustainable. Violence can't be the sustaining force, and that's why slavery is considered warfare, because it's created in violence and sustained through violence. And yes, it does have to be overthrown through violence. I'm not saying that moral suasion doesn't work. I'm not saying it has to be the only tool. And if we're honest about how change has moved in this country, we teach violence as a solution. Like, think about our syllabi. Like, we go from the slave trade to the American Revolution, from the American Revolution to the Civil War, from the Civil War to World War I, World War II, post 9/11, Vietnam. Like, every single historical benchmark we have is hinged on violence. And we use that to show change or progression. Even in the civil rights movement, it's not about nonviolence at all. The entire long freedom struggle is about a response to violence. Like, the sit-ins, the marches are a response to violence. It is violence. And that's what I mean about the dishonesty of it. We haven't been honest about what white supremacy is.
I kind of just want to have you keep going, but I'm like, yes. So Julia, you're next in the queue for questions. Julia Gaffilch, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
I don't know if she's there.
No?
Okay.
Yes,
I ask it to unmute. Okay, then I have Alex. Go ahead, Alex.
Oh, she said she's
I
trying.
can step in for Julie. I don't know if she's there. I'll DM her in a second. But while we wait for Julia, who is writing a biography of Dessalines right now, yes, looking forward to that one.
Yes.
I wanted to ask a question about what the archive of expressions of possible violence is. Now, you hint at it and go through it in different ways, but this archive seems to have a different texture than other forms of the archive. And I could only describe it really quick as something as like an archive in mixed company. So I'm working right now on a play that is very brutal. Was written translating a play from the Vichy period in Martinique. That was the censored period, when the sort of pseudo-Nazis were there in Martinique, and this crew, the young Césaires and a couple of others, were working on some of their early literature, the young literature, but they were working under censorship. Now, in secret, Césaire was working on a play on the Haitian Revolution. And of course, that got me down a rabbit hole of what I like to call a sort of like a philosophy of danger. How does one rescue the voice written under censorship? So how does one rescue the voice written in mixed company? So a lot of the statements you are able to extract from the archive seem to come from a place where it was like, okay, we're just hanging out with the family in the kitchen table and it's cool. Yeah. But a lot of them are coming from a place of mixed company. So how, as a historian, methodologically, do you approach this different? And I might be asking you for your secrets of the trade.
No. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that, in some ways we have to be able to talk about what's not said, like talk about what's not there. One of the things I do in this article, Dare You Meet a Woman, about Black women abolitionists and violence, is, and Leslie Schwam at the University of Iowa talks about this as well, that we don't oftentimes talk about women. And the way that we get around them is we use these vague terms like the group, the mob, the collective. There was a gathering. There was, a large crowd. The assumption is like the mob is male or women aren't there, or like we only read these things as very masculine. And so I feel like I had to do the same thing when Black people are trying to speak about these things that are sort of cloaked in either anonymity or vagueness. And then also try to find as many ways as I can to show not necessarily what they're saying, but what they're doing. And what they're doing in some ways is just as powerful or equally as powerful as what it is they're saying. So Frederick Douglass can give a lot of speeches, and he does. And he's very explicit about, his thoughts about violence and the utility of violence and how he shifts his, beliefs in seeing it as an effective tool. But there are others that don't have the platform of Douglass and can't sort of voice it in that way. So they just do it. and I try to give examples of what, when enslaved people are running away and they keep corn cutters on them. They have knives, dirk knives on them, shivs with them. They steal their master's pistols. They're very clear about what they're intending to do with those weapons. And I think we can extrapolate a lot about what the possibility or what the capacity to be able to bring about your freedom does when you have those weapons with you. But for the most part, I'm really grateful because Black people in the press talk very openly about what they intended to do. They were very honest about no, what I said was I shot him. And there's a letter in which it's Lewis Hayden. So Lewis Hayden is talking, he's an abolitionist in Boston. He's the head of the Underground Railroad in Boston. And he is talking about Anthony Burns. And so Anthony Burns was a famous slave who escapes, gets to Boston, gets captured. There's a trial. They try to rescue him to get him to freedom. It's unsuccessful. He gets sent back to the South. In the process of sending him back to the South, a U.S. Marshal gets shot and killed. And nobody knows what happened. Some people say, oh, he was stabbed. We don't know how he died, but he bled out. And then Lewis Hayden writes a letter to his homeboy, Thomas Higginson, and says, and they're like, oh, we don't know how the U.S. Marshal died. And Hayden's like, oh yeah, I shot him. And they're like, no, there's no way you could have shot him because they said that the wound was jagged or whatever. And he's like, yeah, I didn't have a bullet. I just had a chig, which is like a jagged piece of metal. So he loads his pistol with this jagged piece of metal and shoots the U.S. Marshal. He was like, I thought he was going to kill my friend, so I shot him. And it's so clear as day. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's no hiding around this. But I think more often, much to my surprise, I will say, Black leaders, men and women, like the woman Amelia Robinson, they were so explicit about what they were doing. They were very clear about, no, when I said I'm going to choke you out, I mean, I will choke you out. And that to me, it's incredible. It's incredible. I think it's harder, believe it or not. It was easier to access these ideas and thoughts about violence in the 19th century than it is in the 20th century. Because in the 20th century, I think there's much more politics or respectability. I think people are much more veiled about how they talk about guns. It wasn't until you get the Deacons of Self-Defense where you start realizing that oh, King carries guns. King's got armed guards. Oh, we don't talk about the fact that King had guns all over his house. We don't talk about the fact that Rosa Parks had guns all over her house. That sort of sentiment of gun ownership is much more private in the 20th century than it is when you are sort of in the wild, wild west that is the 19th century. Hope that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And if I may use the prerogative of one of the co-hosts, I have a little follow-up, which is that part of what made your book great for me, and even seeing it in the chat, is that it also tells another story, not even addressing it directly, which is the fear of white people. and how that discourse, we could say, I think fairly, that the discourse of pacifism, of non-resistance that we see today inherits that fear from the white abolitionists and the Garrison side of the house in the 19th century. I think very few people would disagree with that.
Yeah.
And I see in the history of censorship of the story of the Haitian Revolution, for example, of several of these stories, even the way we playing down the John Brown, that there's this fear that everything is cool as long as it doesn't go to the scary place. The scary place having been always the same scary place.
Yeah.
Armed Black folks.
Yeah.
Taking over their own, forcing their freedom, as you put it, which is brilliant sentence. So that history of that fear has always been there, and I think it's still with us. I sense it, I can smell it. You could cut it. The fear of white folk trying, like that first question that you were asked today. It was like, "Are you sure everything's gonna be okay?" I wonder if you thought about that running current while you were.
I think about it all. I think about it all the time. And what I get my students to try to see is like violence. We're terrified of Black people in violence. Terrified, unfairly so, unhistorically so. Because if we think about the history of racial violence, it is a one-way street, friends. It's a one-way street. Never have you ever heard of a Black person going into a white church and shooting up 9 parishioners. Never have you heard of a Black person bombing a white church and killing 4 little white girls. Never have you ever heard of a Black person, assassinating a white person in their driveway in front of their wife and their children. Like, these things just don't happen. You might find an exception, but the rule is white violence goes in one direction. Even if we take it outside of sort of a racial dynamic and think of like the mass shootings that have happened, in like Vegas or in Colorado or in all of these different places, white men do this. White men do this all the time. And we don't have conversations about how this flows in one direction. I think there is a legitimate fear to have if we saw Black people engaged in the same kind of reprehensible violent acts that white people commit. But we don't see that. We just, we don't see that. So whenever people say to me, "Oh, Black Lives Matter, oh my gosh, they're so terrifying." And I'm like, name me the people that they have killed. Name me the victims. Recount the stories. Tell me, did I miss a byline? Did I miss a headline about BLM bombing a particular place, a church, a school? You just don't see it. And so, but the narrative that gets perpetuated over and over again, and this is also problematic, is that we equate, because we live in a capitalist society, our allegiance to capitalism is everything. So when Black people commit destruction of property, we put it on par with the destruction of people. So that, I'm always trying to say, we have to be clear about what violence is. Is violence setting a cop car on fire? Is violence a brick through a window? Or is violence Mike Brown's dead body in the street for 4 hours? Because those are not the same thing. You know what I mean? A brick through a window is not the same thing as a dead body in the street. It's not the same thing as a knee in the neck. And because we put capital, property, the ownership of things right up there with Black humanity, when Black people commit destruction, it's the same thing as murder. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but it is. White people internalize it. It's the same thing as murder. So the uphill battle is trying to get people to understand, no. This broken window is not the same thing as the bullet that killed Breonna Taylor. It's not the same thing. But in the lens of white supremacy, in the lens of capitalism, it is the same thing. And that's the problem.
Yeah, that CVS in Minneapolis got, soft focus, soft focus treatment. Lots of grief for the CVS and the Target.
For the TJ Maxx, for that
TJ Maxx.
It's so true. It's so true.
So Julia, I think you've come back into the event. Do you want
I
to go
hope
ahead
so. Can you
and
hear
ask your
me?
question? Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Oh
go
my
ahead.
goodness. Okay, I'm gonna actually try and start video. This we did it. Okay. Um, and sorry, I've been wrangling children, and so this is why my phone was not working. And anyway, so some of what you've talked about. Thank you so much for this amazing book, Dr. CarterJackson. I've dug in and I can't wait to read the rest. And some of what I had planned to ask, you've already talked about, especially in response to Dr. Johnson's question. But I wanted to pull out one of my favorite sentences that I'm looking forward to using. And this is from page 5. For the enslaved and Black leadership, violence as a political language meant that Haiti was more than a noun, it was a verb. And it's such a great sentence because so often when the Haitian Revolution is getting talked about as a verb, it's from the perspective of like terrified white planters who are worried that their country or their colony is going to be Saint Domingoed. And so that's such a great sentence. And what I love about your work is that you're kind of challenging the boundaries of politics, but then also challenging the boundaries of who gets considered an abolitionist. And in doing so, you're also challenging readers to expand what is typically understood as politics among the white population. And so their violent acts get read now, kind of using your work and using your framework as politics as well, as you've just been talking about. And as you've just been talking about with the work that I do on Haiti, I also see this kind of claiming of the violence as, yes, we did it, and that was the right thing to do. That was what was called for in this moment. And so rather than, I guess, a question, this is just a celebration of your work and a thank you for writing it. And I'm so excited to use it in the classroom, and I'm so excited to cite it in my own research.
Thank you so much. I'm like, there's so much more I wish I could have said in this book. So I'm doing it in another book. My next book is also on violence. Y'all, I promise, I said my next book is going to be on unicorns and lollipops, because like some of this is so like, violent and depressing. And here I am again writing another book on violence. and just, I feel like, having these conversations like this get my mind percolating, where I'm like, oh man, and I could have said this and I could have said that. And like, it makes me think about not just Black struggle for liberation in the United States, but all around the world, especially in the Black Atlantic. But I've been doing a lot of reading about Haiti and about Guadeloupe, and it's really failed revolution. And it just makes me think about what's possible in other places, what's been achieved in other places. And so, that's the next step for me, is to try to take this conversation a little further, a little deeper, a little wider.
Tamika, go ahead.
So this is actually just a comment. What I love about your book is how it helps us kind of formulate an epistemology of honor, and how Black people in particular redefine the parameters of honor. So much attention, right, has been given to Joanne Freeman's work on, the affairs of honor in dueling culture. And despite all of the attempts, right, to criminalize, hypercriminalize, and demonize this kind of violent resistance, that these people are articulating a kind of ethos, an epistemology around honor that I think really is intervening in the historiography. And so I'm just really excited that you're going to continue this work of teasing out this language of violence, because I think that it has implications for how we've studied ideas like honor that have been really reserved for white men, right, and limited, right? But so thank you.
Thank you. You're spot on. I mean, there's so much honor is the perfect word. I often think that you know, the word I've been using is like our romance. We have a romance with violence in America. We are seduced by it. We love to sort of talk about like the founding fathers and give me liberty or give me death. And there's all of this like nostalgia around violence. I mean, why else do we have like Civil War reenactors? You know what I mean? Like, why would you want to reenact a war? But I think that there's like an obsession. We have an obsession with violence and death. And this is why I was like, unicorns and lollipops will be my next book. But I mean, I'm still trying to get my hands around this, the spirit of this, you know what I mean? What gets to be honorable and what gets despised, what's legit or what's effective and what's like illegitimate and ineffective. And how we write about it in the textbooks is so important, because if we can get people to think wider and deeper about these issues, hopefully we can accelerate like the change that we want to see in the world around us.
Zaka, you're up next. You can go ahead and unmute.
Can I unmute?
Yes, go for it.
Hello, Kelly. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I haven't had the chance to read your book yet, but I will order it. I have a question about the political violence. I don't think, for me, it's not really an issue that violence is a tool for emancipation, obviously, very much coming from a Caribbean experience. However, I have a question from your study. Was some of that violence as a political tool used inward, as in within the Black community? And that's my question.
Yes.
And how do you think about that? Like what would be the result of observing if it existed? Yes.
Yeah. So I got like thrown under the bus maybe a year or two ago, whenever the film Harriet came out, and a whole bunch of like ADOS people came after me. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're like a mafia. But like they were upset about a character in the film Harriet in which there's a Black slave catcher. And I was like, facts, all facts. I write about a Black slave catcher in my book. Well, I don't understand what the problem is. Like, they're effective, people trust them, and then they sell them out. Like, so, and the idea of like mercenaries, hired hands. I mean, goodness, this goes back to like, I don't know, ancient times. There's always been a snitch in every single rebellion, revolt, rumor. There's always the snitch. There's always the mercenary, the hired hand. And there's a story I talk about in the book in which there's a Black guy by the name of Joseph Walker, who basically wins this little Black girl's trust and then, sells her out, steals her $7. All she had was $7 on her. And he, sells her back into slavery. And William Parker and a bunch of his men are like, oh, for his acts, he should die. He should die. And they're so matter of fact about it. And so they send Joseph Walker a note because he's staying at a boarding house. And they're like, yo, bruh, you should get out of Dodge. Like, you should get out of town. He doesn't listen. And at 2 a.m., they come to his boarding house. They drag him out of his room to the forest in the middle of the night, and they flog him. They flog him like to the point of death. And there were other Black people that either they beat up or they beat up and sometimes they recovered, or they beat up and they died like 2 or 3 days later from their wounds. But they were very explicit, like you take up the office of a bloodhound, you're going to be treated like a bloodhound. And so I think that when it comes to liberation, Black people were not colorblind. They weren't like, oh no, he was just trying to make some coin for himself. There's none of that. It's like, you are either with us or you are against us, and it doesn't matter if you are Black or white. We'll take John Brown's, we will cut out Joseph Walker's. And I think that that's a good sort of sentiment to stand by. I mean, there are a lot of white people that I'd much rather have in my corner than like your Joseph Walkers or your hired hands or your snitches. You know, I won't name them, but you know who you are. Like there are always Black people that are gonna undermine the movement. But I think that the way they dealt with them was, you know, instructive to say the least.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anna, you're up next.
I have to unmute myself then. Thank you, Kelly, for this great book that I know already has been inspiring other people who are doing similar work and trying to highlight this dimension of violent resistance against slavery. And my question then, making the bridge with connections then with what we discussed already about other spaces. I have a question for you because, of course, the book is about this use of violence by Black abolitionists. You focus more, of course, on the 19th century, but during the discussion, we have been making these connections with other places and other periods. And I would like you to bring us, in terms of the book, and also perhaps for people who didn't read the book, some nuances in terms of where in the United States this kind of actions, then of this violent means in order to get then for abolitionists for their fight, where it's going on, and to which extent the use of violence changes over time. Then, of course, you start more than 1830s and so on, but of course there is already a sort of abolitionist movement going on before that. I ask that question because in other spaces in the Atlantic world, of course, we had the slave revolts, and these slave revolts used then violent means, then armed resistance. But of course, slavery in itself, violence is intrinsic to slavery. Then responding with violence is just the natural way. And then we know from the work of scholars, even who have been doing work on the African side, then that resistance occurred when people were being captured in the interior, transported to the coast in the slave ships, also when the slave ships not even left yet the coast. Then this process is going on during all the period of the Atlantic slave trade, and of course once in the Americas. But there are nuances also. There are moments when violence is used, and some historians have claimed, for example, that in some circumstances where these revolts were occurring or this armed resistance was taking place, that this was not necessarily intended to consciously undermine or end slavery. In the period, of course, that you are looking at, is the final years, then the final 3 decades of slavery in the United States. But this has been happening before, and sometimes not necessarily very successfully. Then I would like you just to bring to light in terms of how this violent resistance and this abolitionist movement that calls for the use of to respond with violence, the violence that is inflicted on enslaved people, how does it evolve, and to which extent we can find perhaps differences in the different places that you are looking at in the United States?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. That's a lot. I think that so I'll put it this way. I will say that hopefully we can all look at slavery. We can look back at slavery and say, wow, that was wrong. It was bad. It was evil. Yeah, you should have taken up violence. I could understand, or I'm sympathetic to the use of guns and arms and violence as a response to violence. I think we look back on when we can look back with distance, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, or 100, 50 years ago, sure. I think that when we look at something more closer to our present, like Jim Crow segregation, we can say, yeah, Jim Crow was bad. Segregation was bad. It was wrong. It was evil. It's a sin. But I don't know if you should have used violence to overthrow it, or taken up arms, in opposition. And even more so in the 21st century, we have a hard time defining what racism is, let alone like how bad or detrimental or destructive it is. So I think that the advantage point of being in the 19th century is that there is a consensus around the use of violence as being not just effective, but like legitimate. Like, yeah, okay, I buy that. I think when I'm trying to connect, my work to not just the deeper past, but even the more recent present, it's really hard to do. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. I think that, and I've said this a lot before, but there's really, when we're talking about white supremacy, there's no form of activism or protest or pushback that you can give to white supremacy that white supremacy is going to approve of. There's no, like, whether you take a knee or you march or you throw a Molotov cocktail, there's nothing that white supremacy is going to be like, I approve of this message, right? So to try to pinpoint what is effective, I think sometimes is really hard, because none of it's going to get sanctioned. None of it's going to get a stamp of approval, if you will. But the interesting thing is that, and when I look more in the contemporary period, like when I think about the Deacons of Self-Defense in Louisiana and Boscaloosa and how there are children who were protesting, you can read about this account. It's a powerful story in which a deacon of self-defense in broad daylight sees a child about to be attacked, a Black child, pulls out his gun and shoots the white man, like just shoots him. He doesn't kill him, but he shoots him. And, the white man, goes to the hospital. He's fine. But like the result of that was astonishing in that, one, the Black man's not really like arrested or he doesn't go to jail or anything like that. The second thing is that the governor, when this happens, when this Black man shoots this white man in broad daylight for trying to attack a child, he says, all right, Klan, enough. That's it. Fall back. I will send in the troops. We're not doing this anymore. Like, cut. The moment white people are at risk for losing their lives, the violence stops. The violence stops. And I think that, we see a lot of examples in the 20th century in which violence gets employed by Black people, self-defense wise, or protective violence is employed, and the violence halts, it gets arrested. And so I can't, and I'm trying to think of like opportunities in the past or moments in the past before the abolitionist movement where something like that happens. I think it's present. I think it's always present, but it's really powerful to see in the 20th century for me, to see like how in a moment of the long freedom struggle, we're talking about nonviolence, and these deacons of self-defense are like, I shot him and they stopped and it worked. How do you combat that? I don't know, but it's so fascinating to me. It's so fascinating to me.
Thank you.
Alex, did you want to hop in there?
Yeah, I wanna follow up because I think that like, yeah, I shot him and I did it, and I did it was in the period you're studying, at least as it comes through in the book. Then one of the rare instances in the history of American discourse, of national discourse, that we call mainstream or whatever, where a bunch of people say, you know what, it's justified. And I think what your book gets at is that what is really difficult is to justify Black violence in this country. That white violence seems to come with a kind of innocence, even if it's in the most cruel form.
Yep.
It seems to somehow come from angelic beings who can do no wrong.
Yeah.
No matter how unjustified it is. Of course, the discourse on justification of war is as ancient as humanity. I mean, you can think of like Luther talking about like how justified it is to fight against the Muslims and this kind of stuff. And go even way back. But somehow what becomes unjustifiable in American history is Black violence, except for this very brief period, which you're looking at. And maybe that was why it was like not mixed company anymore, and truth to power becomes possible in a way that is not possible later. It's not now. It's definitely not now.
Yeah.
Even during like even the hint of violence, then that's when like the white liberals will find more solidarity right away with their white cousins down at the Republican white cousins than they would with the recognition of the justification of what you call as violence is a tool of the last resort. You repeat this several times, not a like gratuitous thing. A tool of desperation, which can then be justified. That is so hard to show that simple truth about like how it is a tool of desperation and how it is used to fight for one's very life, even now. So I was wondering if any lessons learned.
No, I absolutely agree with everything that you're saying. I think there's such a divide and a double standard in terms of how we interpret violence. And I think that, you know, it's interesting because when we think about slavery, I say, yeah, this is a a choice of last resorts, but really it should have been the first resort. And in some cases it was the first response was violence. But it's hard doing this work. It is like when I think about how William Parker or Eliza Parker or Harriet Tubman or Mary Ann Shadd Cary or Mary Ellen Pleasant, all of these people that I study, how they had to navigate the space, the world that they lived in, the stakes that were in front of them. When I read from John Anderson, when he's like, listen, I don't want to kill you. I don't want to kill you. Just stop pursuing me. I don't want to kill you. If you don't stop, I'm going to kill you. And then he kills him. He's not bragging in that speech. He is grieved. He is trying to reconcile with his spirituality. Am I still a Christian? Am I still a godly man? Because I used violence to take someone else's life that was trying to take mine. These are not easy conclusions. But I think that the fact that Black people tend to always grapple with the gravity of violence in ways that white people just dismiss, just don't have to think about the consequences, the ramifications of their harm, of what that harm does. In the case of Atlanta, he was having a bad day, like in other cases, like we took him to Burger King, I see you got some, that like this sympathy, this empathy that gets poured out for white people is also part of the violence of white supremacy. Like those sentiments are violent. Those ideas are violent because they perpetuate a narrative of harm about who's entitled to be hurt and who can't really be, and who's like above the fray, and it's just, it gets me so angry because you want to believe that in the simplicity of just Black humanity, you want to believe that there's a fairness about how people should be treated. But I think that we've been able to do the hard work of abolishing the institution of slavery somewhat. I put a pin in that because of mass incarceration in the 13th Amendment, but like we've been able to abolish the institution of slavery. Why can't we overthrow white supremacy? Why are we still struggling with Joshua Easton in my book says the spirit of slavery? He says you can overthrow slavery, but if you don't deal with the spirit of slavery, he's talking about if you don't deal with anti-Blackness, because that's really what this is, anti-Blackness, then we're always going to be at war. We're always going to be at war, and the war is not a simplistic one. It's an ideological one. How do we get people to divest themselves of the violence of white supremacy in and of itself? that's something white people have to do. Like, and the thing is, like, I tell people all the time, like, Black people aren't responsible for racism. Like, we're not responsible for our own deaths, you know? But these are conversations I think white Americans have to be willing to have with other white Americans about what they need to divest themselves of and what myths they have believed about themselves or others, in order to keep perpetuating these ideas. But the double standard is, I mean, we saw it on January 6th, clear as day. I mean, oh my God, if Black Lives Matter had stormed the Capitol in that way, like, because we have the history of Tulsa, you know, because we know what happens in places like Chicago, like, we know what happens, you know, Vanessa knows this well with Nat Turner, like, we know what happens when Black people cut up, right? And that could have never been Black people, brown people storming the Capitol. But that is how white supremacy works. And, you know, it remains to be seen, like, who will go to jail, you know, who will get a slap on the wrist.
Angels, I tell you, just wilding.
Yeah. It's a whole nother.
It's just like after a basketball game, you know.
It is. It's boys will be boys. It's boys will be boys. And you know, Khalil Muhammad has this great quote. It's in his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, where he says, "White people commit crimes, but Black people are criminals. White people commit crimes, but Black people are criminals." Meaning, white people are like, that's not who they are. Johnny made a mistake. He made an accident. Like that, but that's not who he is. But Black people, it doesn't matter what you do. You're a criminal. You're a criminal. Your very existence is criminal. And that's what we are up against. This myth, it's not even a myth, this reality of who gets to commit crimes and who gets to be a criminal.
I'm going to read one comment in the chat, because I do think that this is something that your book does come around to because of where your endpoint is. And then because I'm helping convene this today, I have a comment I'm going to make. I have so many comments, but I'm just going to try and do that thing where I wrap it into one. So this comment comes from Caitlin Oldham and says, just a comment, mass protests and riots and other forms of forceful activism do move politicians to the left. Studies on this are out there. Even if those politicians claim to disavow the violence or disagree with aims, violent force is effective. And that is something that you end with. I mean, they're not wrong. Yeah. It does take, you know, Turner wasn't wrong. Gabriel wasn't wrong. Denmark Vesey wasn't wrong. You know, the sisters grinding up glass in the mashed potatoes or setting the tobacco barn on fire, they're not wrong. You know, shout out to the Maroons and the Great Dismal Swamp. You know, they're also not wrong. One thing I've been thinking about as you've been talking tonight is Cornelius Eady's poetry collection, Brutal Imagination, that in part is written in the voices of imaginary Black people. So either an imagined Black man who's kidnapped two children that it turns out their white mother just made up to send the police on the wrong trail, or if it's imaginary Black people like Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben. And the extent to which the violence of white supremacy is often against imagined Black people. It's not actually against actual individual Black people that they know, right? Yeah. It's violence against Blackness. It's violence against whatever imagined Black person someone could be. Whereas looking at the ways that Black people deploy violence, it is very specific.
Oh, yeah.
When Turner and the other rebels in Southampton went from home to home, they knew these people. They grew up together. They were very clear who was going to get caught. And some of that fear, you know, we think about certain kinds of violence in this way today, that no, it turns out most violence happens between people who know each other overwhelmingly, and the same with sexual violence and domestic violence. It's people you know in intimate contexts. It's not someone jumping out of the bushes, right? And violence in the 19th century was just this pervasive and well-accepted strategy. It was like also called parenting for most parents in the 19th century, which is violence.
So true. That's so true.
Animal husbandry was violence.
Yeah.
Right? So the ways that, sort of like Shawanda Muscatine talks about that, no, it's language that people become very fluent in very quickly because
it's Douglas says Americans learned and accepted more truth in 4 years of civil war than they learned in 40 years of peace. More truth in 4 years of war than they learned in 40 years of peace. We are hard-headed, right? Like, and I think we don't want nonviolence. We don't want like moral suasion. We don't want these, or we claim that we want it, but that's not what compels us to change. It is not the brutality or the sob story that moves us to create legislation, or that moves us to create new policies. It is violence. That is what puts our feet to the fire and says, okay, hold up, let's change the law, right? Like that is what gets people change. And honestly, as much as we like to talk about again the long freedom struggle and the civil rights movement, it's Watts, right? Watts terrifies people. Like what happened in '68 is a mandate for the change that we need to see, in the '70s and the '80s and all of that stuff. Nobody wants to be Watts. Nobody wants to be, a city up in flames, or Jersey or Detroit. Violence is so instructive. It is so instructive. And if we lived in a different world or in a different society, maybe we would have better alternatives. But I think history has shown us over and over again how much it works, and how it's not just political, as you were saying, Vanessa. It's personal. It's personal. I mean, we're talking about our personhood, and that again, the political and the personal are also conjoined.
Caitlin has reminded us in the chat also about the relationship you've talked about more than once tonight between capitalism and white supremacy, and the ways that violence serves capitalism. There's plenty of evidence that enslavers knew exactly how brutal they were, and knew exactly, and but also knew how very profitable it all was, and that was more important. Do we have any last questions from our group today? I don't see any more raised hands or any more questions. Well, with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. CarterJackson, for joining us tonight, for going in and giving us the good stories, the good names to remember. If you have not gotten a hold of this book, get a copy of Force and Freedom. Do it. Run, don't walk to do it. Thank you so much for gracing us with your wonderful knowledge, giving us these kind of very candid responses to questions, and stunting on us with your amazing gallery wall behind you.
I know. These are people that motivate me to keep doing the work. So thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful. This is again, one of my favorite things to do is be able to talk all things force and freedom. And I just appreciate so much that you appreciate the work. That means a lot to me. All of us scholars spend decades, years working on our books. And so when they can come out into the world and be well received, it's one of the greatest honors. So yeah, thank you.
And Anna, can you remind me of our next date? I'm going to put the link for everybody who's joined us tonight to Slavery Archive Book Club, where you can check out our schedule, and also our schedule for next year that we just posted. You can register there.
Yes, then just folks, oops.
There you are.
Instead of putting the video, then we have another session. This is going to be next Wednesday. Then this is going to be April 14, 5 p.m. You can go and register. This is the new. This is a short book based on a lecture that Professor Stuart Schwartz from Yale University gave, and the book is titled "Blood and Boundaries: The Limits of Religious and Racial Exclusion in Early Modern Latin America." Then we come back to a period that is an earlier period. It's a different space as well, but it's in many ways related to the topics that, of course, we have been discussing here, and perhaps the discussion of how race is framed in the Iberian Peninsula and Latin America as well. And thank you so much again, Kellie, for coming. This is the book. Do not forget to get the book, to read the book. And this is a perfect time for that because we have the entire summer, and next to fall, or even during the summer, perhaps many of you would like to assign Kellie's book for your classes. I think that is a perfect book to address this period of the 19th century, and especially then abolitionist movement from a Black perspective. That is what we are doing here in this book club. And again, folks, thank you so much. Thank you, Vanessa. And I leave you, Vanessa, conclude. I don't know if I don't see Jessica, she is there.
Yes. All right, y'all, have a good night. Thank you so much for joining us.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Be well.
Thanks, Kellie.
Thank you. Bye.